Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast sponsored by 3 Degrees, all about understanding the carbon removals landscape. I'm Nethra Rajendran, the Sustainability Analyst here at GreenBiz, and I'm pleased as always to welcome listeners from around the world. Before we begin, a few housekeeping details. This webcast platform has a number of features I'd like to point out that will make this experience enhanced. So, as shown on the slide, you can resize and move around the various windows on the webcast to optimize your viewing experience. And along with that, on the bottom of the screen, there's a toolbar with various buttons. You can download the resources from today's webcast by clicking the button marked Resources at the bottom. And note this webcast is being recorded and will be shared with all registrants later today. And if you have any questions for today's speakers, we highly encourage you to simply click on the Q&A button and type your questions into the Q&A window that appears. We'll be fielding all of those questions later on in this program and definitely be pulling from that pool. So please don't hesitate to ask along the way. We highly encourage our viewers to participate and feel like they're a part of this experience. You can also chat with other attendees at any time by clicking the group chat button. And finally, feel free to share what you're learning with your Twitter network by using the hashtag GRNBZ. That's GreenBiz without the vowels. And now on to today's discussion. So as many of you know, we are in a period where we must meet knowledge with action. The truth of the matter is that climate change is a top priority, and in order to pump the brakes on irreversible damage that is happening and will continue to happen with the climate crisis, we must act. Lasting mitigation of carbon is critical for keeping emissions within the temperature goals set in the Paris Agreement. Backed by the IPCC, Science-Based Target Initiative, and the United Nations Race to Zero campaign, carbon removals pose a huge opportunity to meet the crucial 1.5 degrees or less global warming trajectory. These initiatives are mandating that corporations use carbon removal to address remaining emissions in their climate targets and to contribute to the global decarbonization on their path to net zero. The carbon removals market is emerging, and there's so many unanswered questions that exist around project-level criteria, methodologies, and scalability. New innovative pathways for removing and storing carbon are also emerging and constantly changing. And standard bodies are still shaping methodologies for these types of projects and working to synergize what that means in our society. So with so little concrete guidance, how can organizations help build a prosperous carbon removals market that will meet the demands of the net zero economy? Well, that's what this webinar is hopefully here to address. And we have some great speakers on our panel today that have such interesting takes on these concerns that are on so many of our minds. So the main points that we will be covering in this webcast is the current carbon removals market, the possible carbon removal procurement pathways, key considerations and screening criteria for corporate carbon removal buyers, and actions that scale up the supply for carbon removals. And with that, I would love to introduce today's lovely speakers. We have Steph Harris, who is the Director of Carbon Markets at 3 Degrees, and Maggie Lund, who is the Policy Manager of Carbon Markets and Corporate Carbon Strategies at 3 Degrees. And myself, again, Nethra Rajendran, who is a Sustainability Analyst at GreenBiz. And now I would love to pass it along to Steph and Maggie to get into today's conversation. Oops. Oh, and also, I'm sorry, before that, we do have a quick poll. I would highly encourage everyone in the audience to participate. And I'm going to give us about 30 seconds to just dive into this question here. Perfect. Well, with that being said, I am going to now hand it off to our lovely speakers, Steph and Maggie.
Thank you so much, Nethra, and hello, everyone. Thank you. We really appreciate you all being here today. I'm Steph Harris, Director of Carbon Markets at 3 Degrees. And before we dive into content today, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of 3 Degrees and who we are and what we do. So for those of you who aren't familiar with 3 Degrees, we are a global climate solutions provider driven to help businesses take urgent action on climate change. As one of the pioneers in this space, we've been at this for nearly 20 years. We partner with organizations worldwide to help them set ambitious and credible climate goals and enable them to take action to address their emissions. The 3 Degrees team brings deep expertise in climate strategy and implementation across scopes 1, 2, and 3, including net zero, global environmental commodities, renewable energy and carbon project development, transportation decarbonization, as well as electric and gas utility voluntary programs. We are also a proud certified B Corporation with a social mission to advance a just transition through our work. At 3 Degrees, we're committed to creating a better, more equitable, low carbon future for all people. And a bit about our experience in the carbon market. The 3 Degrees carbon team has been working in the carbon markets since the market's inception in the early 2000s. We actively develop and manage carbon credit projects and have developed over 50 projects to date with dozens of new projects in our development pipeline. My team works on the ground with projects, managing the monitoring, reporting, and verification processes, which are required to actually create carbon credits. Recently, we've been increasing our development focus on new carbon removal projects in categories such as biochar, CO2 storage in concrete, and bioenergy carbon capture and storage, or BECCS, all of which we will touch on in a few slides. We're also tracking the development of new methodologies, standards, and protocols that will allow us to continue to expand our work across additional project types and categories. And now I'm going to pass it back to Nethra.
Great, thank you. We have another poll question here. So I'd like to give our audience a couple minutes to answer that. So the question is, where is your organization in its carbon removal procurement journey? The first being, my organization is not interested in adding carbon removals to our sustainability strategy. Second, my organization is in the early stages of exploring options for carbon removal procurement. And the third, my organization is already purchasing carbon removals. I'll give us about 20 more seconds there to bring those answers in. Great. Well, looks like from those who have answered, we have a pretty wide variety of people in their carbon removal procurement journey here, but the majority of our audience is leaning towards saying 65%, 65.2% to be exact, saying, my organization is in the early stages of exploring options for carbon removal procurement. So we have a lot of curious folks in the audience who this webinar be quite useful for. That's very interesting. And we have 23% of people saying my organization is already purchasing carbon removals, and 11.9 saying my organization is not interested in adding carbon removals to our sustainability strategy. So Steph and Maggie, we have quite the mix of people here. Let's move on to the next question. Does your organization have a long-term net zero target? If so, with which initiative? First being Science-Based Targets Initiative. Second is Race to Zero. 3, Self-Determined. 4, we do not currently have a net zero target. And 5, Other. I'll give us about 30 seconds here. Wonderful. Okay, let's see the results. Okay, so we have a good amount of people in the audience with science-based target initiatives, goals that are aligning with that. But we also have a good amount of people, if not a close to equal amount of people, that do not have a net zero target, which means to those, you are in the right place. We have some resident experts here that are going to give us some good insight into different components of that. 6.4% with the race to zero targets, 16.8% with self-determined targets. For those who answered that, we'd love to see in the chat bar and in the Q&A what those self-determined targets look like. And we have 6.4 with other. Also interested in tapping a little bit more into that. Thank you for all those who participated. And great, I'd love to hand it back to Steph and Maggie.
Awesome, thanks so much, Nethra. So let's start with some background on the state of the carbon removals market today. So zooming out a bit, let's set the stage and ask the question, why are we here today talking about carbon removals? The answer is that large-scale carbon removal is now a fundamental component of our global climate transition. That conclusion actually comes straight from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, which releases landmark reports on the state of climate change every 6 to 7 years. In their most recent report, they said that based on our current emissions trajectory, anywhere from 6 to 11 billion tons of greenhouse gases will need to be removed from the atmosphere every year starting in 2050 to limit warming to 1.5 degrees and avoid catastrophic climate change. So clearly there's a scientific mandate to companies that carbon removal should be incorporated into their climate plans. And that mandate has luckily been echoed by the standards and initiatives that provide guidance to companies on how to align their emission reduction goals with global net zero. Essentially, the major corporate net zero standards, including the Science-Based Target Initiative and Race to Zero, are requiring companies to neutralize any residual emissions in their net zero target year with removals. Put simply, this means that companies with net zero targets will be expected to reduce their emissions as much as possible between now and 2050. By SBTi's definition, that means at least 90% of value chain emissions must be reduced. Any remaining greenhouse gas emissions that are either technologically or financially impossible to reduce must be matched in equal quantity with carbon removal that occurs either within or outside of their value chain. So that's why carbon removal is necessary. But what is carbon removal? How do we define it? And how are companies supposed to support it? You can think of carbon removal as a type of carbon credit, meaning each metric ton of carbon removed from the atmosphere is quantified and verified. More mature forms of carbon removal can ultimately be issued as tradable credits, but it's also a bit more complicated than that. Just like with traditional carbon credits, carbon removals need to meet baseline criteria around additionality, which means that they're beyond business as usual. This usually means that the revenue from the sale of the carbon removal is what's driving the project to happen. Of course, carbon removal projects also need to be verifiable, but removals must be tested against some unique criteria as well. That includes net negativity, which requires projects to prove that they are actively removing more carbon than they emit. I'll come back to that later. But of particular importance to carbon removals are the concepts of durability and reversal risk. These two concepts are intertwined to some extent, but durability refers to the length of time that carbon is stored. This can range anywhere from a few decades to tens of thousands of years. Risk of reversal refers to the risk that stored carbon will be emitted back into the atmosphere from the sink that it is stored in. So with these criteria in mind, let's take a look at a few examples of projects that can remove carbon from the atmosphere. You can think of projects as roughly falling into one of three categories, the first being nature-based or biological projects. Projects that fall into this category usually protect or restore natural landscapes, and through that process, store carbon in biological sinks. These projects often store carbon for relatively short timeframes, usually for a few decades, and they experience higher risk of reversal, so think forest fires. But they also provide crucial benefits beyond just carbon mitigation, like ecosystem preservation, and we truly can't ignore these projects if we're to hit global net zero by 2050. On the other end of the spectrum, we have engineered projects, which use technology to take carbon directly out of the atmosphere. Usually direct air capture is the example that comes to mind with this category. So engineered projects are really additional. They can store carbon for hundreds of thousands of years if monitored correctly, and they have very little risk of reversal. But on the flip side, these processes can be really energy intensive, meaning that they usually need to be powered by renewable energy to meet that net negativity criteria I discussed on the previous slide. They're also currently really expensive and pretty scarce in the market. And then somewhere between these two categories are hybrid projects, which use a combination of biological and technological carbon storage. Depending on the specific project type, these projects could fall anywhere on the quality criteria spectrum I discussed on the last slide. And let me also note here, these project types are not an exhaustive list of what is or will be available in the carbon removals market. New approaches to carbon removal are being invented on a really frequent basis, and existing approaches are being continuously improved. And as a note, all forms of carbon removal will be needed to address climate change. So with that foundational knowledge of the market in mind, let's take a look at where there are some opportunities for growth and development. As I mentioned, supply of removals is pretty limited today, particularly when looking at high durability engineered projects. To meet the demand of all companies with net zero targets by 2050, supply is going to have to be scaled rapidly. And that means that a lot of private sector investment is going to be needed. Another opportunity for market development is with third-party standards and methodologies. Because many carbon removal approaches are relatively new, many standards that have historically provided third-party oversight to the voluntary carbon market, like Verra and Climate Action Reserve, are still in the process of developing quantification methodologies and rules for removals projects. We're also seeing some groups call for the creation of entirely new third-party standards specifically for carbon removals. But ultimately, increased third-party engagement, verification, and oversight will improve standardization across the entire removals market. And then finally, and this is the big one, it's not yet clear which types of removals will be eligible to neutralize residual or remaining emissions under existing net zero standards like Science-Based Target Initiative. This decision could go in many different ways. It's possible that only removals with high durability will be accepted, but it's also possible that standards will require removals that store carbon for a similar amount of time as the initial source the carbon came from. So, for example, biogenic emissions could potentially be matched with biological removals, while fossil fuel-based emissions would have to be matched with engineered removals. Regardless, we can expect the decision on removal eligibility by net zero standards to ultimately influence demand, which in turn could influence which types of projects and technologies receive investment and are able to scale quickly. So an important thing to understand about the removals market is that in a lot of ways, it's being led by pioneering corporate purchasers. The name you'll probably hear most frequently in this space is Microsoft, which actually has set a really ambitious goal to be carbon negative by 2030. That means they're going to be removing more carbon from the atmosphere than they emit. Because of that goal, they're one of the biggest corporate purchasers of removals in today's market. But what's really awesome about what Microsoft is doing is they're publishing their criteria for high quality, impactful carbon removal purchases. This means that buyers at any stage of their procurement journey can use Microsoft's work to inform their own removal purchasing decisions. Another approach that leading companies are taking to carbon removal procurement is aggregation. Steph will talk about aggregated purchasing in a bit more depth later, but one notable name in this space is Frontier Climate. Frontier is led by Stripe and collects investment from numerous companies, then directs that investment into high durability carbon removal projects. Their focus is on funding technologies that have the greatest potential to scale. And that is the end of my section and the background on the carbon removals market. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Steph to discuss how buyers can engage with the carbon removals market today.
Thank you so much, Maggie. So now that we've talked about the current market landscape, let's dive into what this actually means for buyers who are interested in participating in the market now, or buyers who will eventually need carbon removal credits to achieve a future state of net zero. Starting with procurement pathways, as organizations plan to incrementally phase carbon removals into their carbon portfolio, they will need to think through various procurement structures that might make sense for their organization as they start to engage with the market and with projects. So starting with existing projects, there are removals credits available in the market today from nature-based projects with shorter-term durability. A few examples of these project types include improved forest management, known as IFM, afforestation, reforestation, revegetation projects, also known as ARR, and improved grasslands management projects. For these project types, there are two primary procurement options that companies are already incorporating into their existing carbon credit portfolios. The first structure is spot purchasing, which involves buying credits that have already been verified and issued, typically buying on an annual basis. The other option is a multi-year offtake agreement, which is a commitment to buy a stream of credits for multiple years at a time, usually at a fixed price. Note with this structure, there might be some misalignment between projects that have an optimistic market outlook and buyers who only have a set budget to spend on credits. But if the stars do align, this can be a very valuable option for the parties involved. It's also likely that both of these structures will become more common for credits from hybrid or engineered removals projects over time, as credits from those project types become more widely available in the market. But right now, there are other structures buyers might consider when working with new projects. Similar to working with existing projects, a forward offtake commitment is a powerful mechanism for supporting new projects, as this provides a guaranteed revenue stream for the project developer over a set amount of time. This structure also provides budget certainty for the buyer over the term of the agreement, making them somewhat immune to price fluctuations in the broader market. As I just mentioned, we might see some misalignment here between projects that are feeling very optimistic about where the market's going in terms of price and buyers who only have a certain amount of budget to spend on carbon credits. But again, this can be a great option if there is agreement and alignment between the parties involved. This structure usually minimizes some of the financial risk for the buyer, as payments are usually deployed upon credit delivery. So in other words, buyer doesn't need to provide any payment until the credits are actually verified and issued. A prepayment is also a valuable contracting option for new projects. It provides some or all of the upfront capital needed for the development and implementation of a new project that otherwise might not have been available. In return for this prepayment, the organization that has provided the funding receives the carbon removal credits over time, usually at some discount for the project developer utilizing their capital. This structure can be riskier than a forward offtake commitment, as the offtaker is providing capital to the project before credits are issued, exposing them to project development risks. There are ways to mitigate these risks, such as deploying payments at various project milestones, but I'm not going to go into too much detail on that today. Another less common option is an equity investment, where an organization invests directly into a company or specific asset. In addition to access to removals credits, this structure might also provide a financial return for the organization, but it also bears the greatest amount of risk. Other companies, as Maggie mentioned, are choosing to aggregate their demand to purchase removal credits from new projects. This approach, of which the frontier aggregation is a good example, often focuses on helping scale new carbon removal technologies and allows a collective group of organizations to increase their overall impact. Although we're seeing aggregation be mostly applied to new projects, this structure can also work well for an existing portfolio of projects. So as described on this slide, all of these options have varying levels of upside and risk. Each organization is going to have to determine which option or combination of options bear an acceptable amount of risk for your business. Also, certain investment structures are definitely better suited for certain project types. So while nature-based solutions are readily available in the market today, engineered solutions may require longer-term procurement structures to become more viable in today's market environment. And before your organization makes any decisions about procuring carbon removal credits, if you haven't done so already, there's a number of questions that you might want to ask in order to define the company's risk tolerance and ultimately the procurement path forward. For example, if your organization is supporting new projects, what is the tolerance for financial risk? as discussed on the previous slide, is your organization willing to make an upfront commitment of financial resources to a new project, knowing that credit volumes might be smaller than expected or credits may never be issued at all, and then your organization is exposed to that risk? On credit volumes, your organization should identify if specific credit volumes will be needed annually and when they will be needed. And if so, how can your organization manage volume fluctuations in projects from project volumes and credit volumes? Some project developers may not want to make fixed volume commitments to a buyer, knowing that project volumes can change. So how well can your organization manage that risk? On cost, how does your organization plan to set a budget for carbon removals? Will it come from an internal carbon tax or some other source? And how does the budget complement or align with the organization's broader decarbonization strategy? On project criteria, at a minimum, how does the project address additionality, leakage, permanence, and other key quality criteria that we discussed in the previous section? Is it important to your organization that the project is registered with one of the widely recognized standards bodies using an approved methodology? We recommend buyers work with projects that are registered with standards bodies that provide third-party oversight. However, we see some market participants in this space choosing to forego this criteria in order to help scale new technologies. But this often translates into a very different type of claim that's focused on catalyzing market development. Also, does your organization have a preference for projects related to your business or projects within the same geographic region as your business operations? On co-benefits, is it important for your company to work with projects that generate co-benefits that align with the company's mission or maybe with broader organizational priorities? And then lastly, on claims, it's important for your organization to define the goals that you're trying to achieve and how carbon removal credits will help you achieve that goal. Will your organization need to secure credits quickly, or can removals be phased into a portfolio over time? Another important point on claims is that historically, companies have volumetrically matched carbon credits to unabated emissions in order to make traditional offsetting or carbon neutrality claims. This framework holds companies accountable for their prior year's emissions by requiring that they compensate for those emissions with an equal number of carbon credits. This often means that buyers have to prioritize both quantity as well as quality of carbon credits, which can often make it challenging for buyers to invest in new projects. This is because traditional offsetting claims require having quantified, verified, and issued credits according to established methodologies. As previously mentioned, investment in new projects usually bears some amount of project level risk, and buyers who need a set quantity of credits year over year may not be in a great position to manage those risks. So as an alternative to volumetric matching, companies can consider a contribution-based approach to their carbon removal purchases. While contribution has been defined in a variety of ways across different initiatives, for the purposes of today's presentation, I'm describing an approach that involves establishing a financial target for carbon removal procurement, which focuses on the quality or impact of the credits rather than the total quantity. Companies pursuing a contribution-based approach may ultimately purchase fewer credits at higher prices than companies volumetrically matching, but the carbon credits they do purchase could help scale new technologies or generate substantial co-benefits for surrounding communities. This approach also encourages companies to make transparent claims on the projects supported, which could increase reputational rigor. Claims accompanying the contribution approach generally place less emphasis on offsetting a company's individual emissions and instead focus on making a contribution to market development, climate change mitigation, and or global emissions removed from the atmosphere. This approach can also be applied to new carbon avoidance projects as well as part of an organization's larger beyond value chain mitigation strategy. So ultimately, each of these considerations represent varying levels of risk and should be factored into every buyer's investment decisions. and the level of risk your organization is willing to take on should inform the types of projects you support and the structure of your purchase. So what does all of this mean moving forward for buyers? In the absence of clear guidance from standard setting organizations like SBTI or the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, there are some next steps that organizations can implement today to help prepare themselves for a more robust carbon removals market in the future, particularly as companies are working towards their net zero targets. First, it's important to develop an understanding for how removals will help your organization meet long-term goals based on current guidance. We know that SBTI will require some type of removals in a company's net zero target year and beyond, but we don't exactly know what will qualify yet. So are there projects that your organization feels comfortable supporting now, nature-based removals, for example? And then how can your organization figure out transitioning the portfolio over time to more durable engineered removal solutions? Your organization will also want to determine how credits from avoided emissions projects will complement any removals purchases and play a role in your organization's beyond value chain mitigation strategy. From there, your organization should identify procurement decisions that you can make today and really identify how much risk your organization is willing to take on. This will likely require going through a checklist of questions that help identify various procurement risks and methods for mitigating those risks. Finally, define the unique role that your organization wants to have in the carbon removals market based on points 1 and 2. For example, do you want to make advanced market commitments to projects that are still in early stages of development? Or do you want to support existing projects today that have significant co-benefits? Do you want to find a like-minded group of organizations that are making commitments to carbon removal projects and pool your resources together to expand the scope of work? Given the newness and nascency of this market, there is ultimately no single approach to participating in the carbon removals market today. Each organization has a very unique role to play depending on your organization's goals, your company values, the areas of influence your organization has. And all of these factors combined will help determine how your company should decide to participate in the market today and in the future.
Great. Thank you, Steph and Maggie, for that wonderful presentation and also interesting insight that has clearly sparked a lot of questions from the audience. So before we get into these really juicy questions that our audience members have submitted, I have a question for both of you that actually does reflect a couple of the audience members' curiosities, but what are the current prices for removal credits compared to avoidance credits? And do you expect prices to change much in the next few years?
I'm happy to kick this one off. So I'll start with, it depends. So it completely depends on a number of factors of where pricing is potentially going to land. So that can include the type of transaction and the commercial terms, but generally speaking, I would say avoidance credits are anywhere from $3 to $20 in the market right now. But again, that depends on a number of factors. What type of project is it? Where is it based? How large is the potential transaction? Removals credits from nature-based projects might be anywhere from $10 to $30 per ton. We're seeing early price signals for removals credits from new engineered hybrid projects in the maybe $100 to $200 range, but we've also seen pricing all the way in the $600 range up to $1,000+ per credit. So we're very much all over the map depending on the specific technology and the stage that it's at. In terms of price expectations changing over time, I think the goal and the hope is that absolutely some of these prices will come down as these technologies can scale and there's more credits available in the market or more organizations making advanced commitments to projects that gives those price signals to projects that the demand is there and that folks are willing to pay higher prices than they've paid in the past for removals credits. So I think that that's the goal, is for a lot of these prices to come down, but without a crystal ball, I can't say for certain, but I think that's definitely the direction that we're heading.
Right. And on the same note of considering removals, I think there's been a lot of notion around the thought that we should focus our efforts on reduction before considering removals. Do you think companies should start prioritizing the use of removals now, or wait until they're closer to their net zero target year?
Sure, I can take that one. So I think it's true that what we need today are reductions, right? If we're to hit net zero by 2050, we're going to need to reduce a lot of emissions and then remove what's left. And so companies certainly should not be ignoring reductions, and that holds particularly true for their own value chains. So companies really should be prioritizing internal emissions reductions within their operations first. The Oxford Net Zero principles on net zero aligned offsetting are really a helpful model for thinking about transitioning your carbon credit portfolio more towards high durability removals over time in line with net zero. But generally, each company should make its own decision about the role it wants to play in the market. So if you're a company and you want to focus on scaling the carbon removals market for 2050 because your specific operations or goals relate to carbon removal, I think that's an absolutely acceptable approach. But I think for most companies, you are going to want to certainly prioritize reductions, especially within your own value chain in the short term.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And as we could see based on our poll, that I believe it was around 32% of our attendees have not set net zero targets within their organization. So the next question relates to that, being someone had submitted saying, my company has not set any long-term reduction targets. And honestly, we don't know where to begin. Does 3 Degrees offer any consultancy services to companies looking to set these short-term and long-term goals?
Yes, absolutely. We have a practice internally that can help companies set, figure out what their goals are, set internal strategies for and implementation strategies for how to help achieve those goals. So if you're within that category and you're wanting to know how do we begin, we absolutely would love to help you with that.
Great, thank you. And now I'm going to be turning my attention to the Q&A section, which thank you for everyone who submitted questions. Another one we have from the audience is, someone said, with carbon removals being necessary for residual emissions neutralization, do you see tension with companies moving away from avoidance and reduction offset projects that have large significant impact on biodiversity, SDG goals, et cetera, but just unfortunately don't count towards net zero neutralization?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. I think that really reflects on the answer I just provided, which is that it's true that removals are what is acknowledged under net zero standards. So I do think that companies who set net zero targets, focus on what is acceptable under those goal setting frameworks, because that's how they're kind of driving their own internal climate action. And so there may be, a prioritization of removals to the detriment of avoided or reduced emissions projects that have these benefits. I don't think that that's what we would encourage. And I think generally, as I said, there's a scientific need for carbon reductions, and there's certainly a need to protect the forests that exist today. I don't think we can possibly meet the goals of the Paris Agreement if we allow for continued deforestation. So I would say that, yes, I do think that there's a tension. But at the same time, the neutralization of residual emissions is coming into play at the net zero target year. So that's 2050 in most cases. We're still 25 years away from that. So I think companies should start to think today about their removal strategies and how they can kind of ramp that up over the long term. But it's still really important in the short term to be thinking about carbon reductions and also these projects that deliver massive co-benefits to forests and other natural land uses that go beyond just carbon mitigation.
I'll also add to what Maggie said around a lot of the new standards and net zero initiatives that we're seeing are encouraging beyond value chain mitigation, which can take the form of supporting avoidance projects as well as removals projects prior to net zero target year. And I think a lot of us are really curious and excited for Science-Based Targets Initiative to provide more guidance on beyond value chain mitigation, ideally this year, that can provide a little bit more guidance for buyers who are really curious, how should I direct budget into these areas? And is there kind of an endorsed way or one way to do that that continues to support natural landscapes in the near term that complements work that other organizations are doing? I'll also add, there might be companies out there that are set net zero targets or starting to set net zero targets or just long-term carbon reduction commitments. And there aren't feasible technologies or real solutions today that companies can implement to help them achieve those targets in the near term. So projects, carbon credit projects from avoidance projects that complement longer term goals that companies have set but maybe aren't really able to take urgent action in those areas today. This is a viable way for those organizations to really take that urgent action that can advance global climate mitigation in areas where they might have more influence now than they would for internal abatement, which obviously we should also be very much prioritizing.
Right. Thank you for that. And to get into a nitty-gritty question here, someone asks, how do you determine how much credit you need to purchase or carbon to remove? What is the better way of estimating carbon emissions beyond self-estimation? Estimation. My apologies.
Yeah, I'm happy to also take that, and then Steph, feel free to chime in. So I think historically, a lot of companies have looked at, so you conduct your greenhouse gas inventory, right? So you start with understanding your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And then on your way to net zero, you look at what amount of emissions continue to be unabated, right? What remains in my inventory that I'm not addressing through internal action? A lot of companies historically have taken an approach where they volumetrically match 1 ton of carbon reduction or removal to, 1 ton of unabated emission. So it's really a 1-to-1 situation. The problem with that approach is that sometimes it leads to companies pursuing the lowest cost credits rather than ones that might have maximum impact or more certainty around quantification and additionality. So it's not a terrible approach, but you just have to be really intentional with the credits that you're purchasing when you decide to go down that route, because you can kind of easily fall into this pattern of purchasing credits that may be dubious. What we think might be a better approach, a more proactive approach, and one that's kind of emerging in the market, is to price your unabated emissions. So set a carbon price for each ton of carbon that you continue to emit, and then use that to purchase carbon credits. So you're not necessarily matching each ton of your unabated emissions to a carbon credit, but you have a budget for carbon, and that allows you to channel money into the most impactful projects or ones that really align with your organizational priorities. So I think those are two options, but the reality is there's a number of different approaches, and there's no prescribed way to really go about doing that.
And what I'll add to that, Maggie, is in addition to the quantification and budget allocation, is being really transparent at the end of the day about the approach you take, and being very transparent to your internal and external stakeholders about the footprinting that you've done, the internal abatement plan that you have in place, the carbon credits that you have purchased and the mechanism by which you've done that. Does that, whether it comes from an internal carbon tax or some other budget that's been allocated, and then just really clearly communicating the approach that you've taken so that that transparency exists for the organization's stakeholders, I think is ultimately the best practice that we would recommend, since there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach right now to purchasing carbon credits to address unabated emissions.
Absolutely. And thank you, Steph and Maggie, for touching on those points of transparency and accountability within this market, because there has been scrutiny recently around this topic. And we have, questions and comments coming into the QA saying, how do we address greenwashing and how do we address the scrutiny on the carbon credits field and the spotlight there. So I think that emphasis on transparency and being and holding accountability as a top priority is very important, a very important distinction to make. And on that note, we have a question from the audience asking, on the contribution approach, how can contributions be measured in a standardized way that encourages accountability and comparison across organizations?
I'm happy to lead.
Kick us off, Maggie. Yep.
So we like to, I think that what I just mentioned about pricing your unabated emissions is one way to start to standardize your approach to contribution, right? Because at that point, you may not technically even be offsetting. You're really kind of contributing to global mitigation by pricing your unabated emissions and then funneling investment to specific projects that you find high impact. I think that there is a lot of work to be done on the contribution approach. So this is really emerging right now. There are some organizations that have provided guidance on contribution for quite a few years, namely Gold Standard, which is one of the big carbon credit registries, and also WWF. They published a document called the Blueprint for Corporate Climate Action or something like that a few years ago. And they also touch on an approach to contribution that you can kind of use as a standardized framework. But I think we're really looking to some of the existing standards in the market to provide more clarity on standardized contribution approaches. So that includes one initiative called the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, or VCMI. They are publishing a final draft of their claims guidance and framework for companies on the pathway to net zero. And we hope that they'll include some guidance around how companies should be making standardized contribution claims. The Science Based Target Initiative is also supposed to be releasing some blog posts this year on what they call beyond value chain mitigation, which can include the purchase of carbon credits. And some of their preliminary work implies that they may also be addressing the contribution approach in those and that guidance that they published this year. So I think that there's work to be done, and hopefully we'll see some of that work done this year.
Great, thank you. And we also have a question regarding Article 6 and wondering, how will Article 6 impact the voluntary market for removals and how will it affect pricing in the future? And Steph and Maggie, if you wouldn't mind explaining to some of our audience members who are not familiar, what is Article 6? And then, how does it impact the voluntary market for removals?
Yes, these are all coming to me, so sorry, Steph, I'm not
You're
trying
doing
to
great.
throw your thunder here. So backing up a bit, Article 6 is part of the Paris Agreement that was agreed upon in 2015. Article 6 sets out a framework for carbon trading between countries that allows countries to use emissions reductions that might have occurred outside of their border, reductions or removals, to meet their nationally determined contribution, or NDC, which is really an emissions reduction goal. Under Article 6, there's a number of different trading frameworks that are set out. So you have Article 6.2, which is really high-level bilateral agreements between countries that have already started being made today. You have Article 6.4, which is more of a carbon credit registry type of situation. So they will be establishing a new marketplace with their own rules for carbon removals and reductions. It's still in development, so nothing's been issued under Article 6.4 yet. And then you have Article 6.8, which is a non-market-based approach to funding carbon reduction and removal. So the current status of removals under Article 6 is that there was a submitted framework and rules for removals to be accepted under Article 6 at the last COP, but I believe the decision was that it wasn't stringent enough. So pretty much the parties to the Paris Agreement said, go back to the drawing board and provide us with a new framework for removals that we can have a bit more confidence in. So I think at a high level, you can expect Article 6 to increase demand for carbon reduction and removals across the board, because it really sets out this whole new market. I think in terms of the specific role removals will play and which ones will be eligible under Article 6, still to be determined. There's a lot of work to be done, and it's something we're certainly tracking, but I think it'll be a few years until the rules are finalized and it becomes clear the impacts on the removals market and the reductions market.
And in general, I think we are assuming that eventually there will be overlap between the voluntary carbon market and the various Article 6 markets and credit trading schemes. We're also assuming that there will absolutely be a role for corporate action to play in the voluntary market that complements the work being done at the country level based on countries' NDCs, nationally determined contributions, or how they anticipate, at a country level to achieve their targets set out for the Paris Agreement. So we know that there will likely be overlap, but we also know that whether that's a different sort of claim that needs to be made or a different mechanism for contribution, that there will absolutely continue to be a role for corporate climate action to play that doesn't overlap, but very much complements the work that countries will be doing at the national level. So don't have specifics yet as the bigger frameworks and NDCs and how countries will achieve their NDCs is all still being worked out, but stay tuned. Maybe on the next webinar, we'll know more.
Great. Yes. And I think we have time for about one or two more questions. So I'm pulling from one that says, there's a lot of marketplace options out there. What's the best route to decide who to purchase from?
That's a good question. I think, I don't have a specific or unbiased answer that I will provide. I'll say it's going to depend on the organization's priorities and the goals they want to achieve and how they want to achieve those goals. There's a lot of very credible, very experienced project developers and participants and various players in the market that have an extensive track record of delivering on credible solutions. And so I'd say if you're just getting started, have a lot of conversations and figure out, based on what your organization is trying to achieve and how you anticipate getting there, have conversations with various players to figure out who is providing solutions that best complement the work that you want to achieve and how you want to get there. So obviously 3 Degrees is an active participant in the carbon market. So I have to say that since we're here today, but there's a lot of very credible market players that we also work with. So I'll leave it at that.
Sure. Great. And lastly, we have a recent question saying, are carbon removals integrated into CDP or SBTI standards currently?
So SBTI, I think I've touched on a little bit, but right now, the way it's integrated into that standard is that you are expected to purchase removals to match your residual or remaining emissions at the net zero target year. So before that point, it's really not integrated. But at 2050 or your net zero year, it is going to be part of achieving that target setting framework. I will say SBTI strongly encourages companies to engage with the carbon market and engage in beyond value chain mitigation on the pathway to net zero. So it's not a requirement of their standard, but their stance, and I think our stance is, you should take all actions you possibly can to reduce your emissions internally, but that doesn't mean you're off the hook on the pathway to net zero for the emissions that you don't abate year over year, right? For those unabated emissions, you really should be purchasing carbon credits or engaging in, other types of beyond value chain mitigation, like policy advocacy or investing in kind of technologies that need to scale, that catalyze innovation. It's not a requirement at this point for SBTI. CDP, that's a good question. I don't actually know the answer off the top of my head in terms of removal specifically and their role in CDP reporting. If it's along the same lines as carbon credit reporting, then I'm guessing the role that removals play is you can report it as a separate category and potentially get some points for that, but it doesn't apply against your scope of emissions. And I think that's a really important point broadly on this issue of transparent claims and the way you talk about your carbon credit purchases. You really should be intentional about disclosing your remaining emissions, your greenhouse gas inventory, and then talking about your carbon credit purchases separately, right? So if you have 100,000 tons of greenhouse gases that you're responsible for, and then you buy 50,000 carbon offsets, it's not transparent to then say, oh, we only have 50,000, we're only responsible for 50,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions. The categories of disclosure should be separate. And I'm guessing that is the role of removals and CDP reporting as it is with reduced and avoided emissions.
Absolutely. Well, I really want to thank both of you for being here today. And that's all the time that we have. Before we move on to our closing, I'd like to ask one final question to the audience, which is, would you be interested in learning more about carbon credits or removals? And while you're answering that, I'd like to again thank 3 Degrees, our sponsor, for making this webcast happen. If you'd like to rewatch this webcast, the recording will be archived on greenbiz.com, and our team will be emailing you a link once it's available later today. You can also check out the resources on this topic by clicking on the resources button at the bottom of your screen. And that includes a white paper released by 3 Degrees on understanding the carbon removals landscape, and of course, the webcast slides. Thank you again. And here are the resources that we will be providing once again. And thanks to everyone for joining. You will be emailed this recording very shortly, hopefully by the end of today. Thanks, Steph and Maggie.
Thanks, Nethra.
Nethra.